Hello, I'm going to be doing a little bouncing ball demo to kind of show you my workflow and how I would approach doing a bouncing ball using the Maya tools. Now I've set up a little scene here. I have a ground plane and I have two balls. I have a bowling ball and I have what I'm thinking of as being a tennis ball, and I'm going to make these two balls do a little animated bounce. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to start with the tennis ball here, and that'll be the first one that I'm going to go through. But what I'm going to do is I'm also going to start to make sure that my settings are right, and I'm going to go down to the lower right hand corner. There's a little button here, the animation preferences, and I'm going to open that up. I'm going to do a couple of little things here. First thing is sometimes it opens right to time slider, and if it's not, you want to scroll down to time slider and you want to change your playback speed to real time, 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second, whatever you're working in. We usually work in 24 frames per second. I'm also going to go to animation. It's right under settings. So there's settings, and right under there's a setting animation, and I want to set my tangents, and these are my control curve tangents, which we're going to look at a little bit later, and I want to change those to linear just for now, and we can change these later, but I'm just going to keep it on linear just to kind of show what kind of different curve controls that we have, and then I'm going to save that. So let's start our animation. So I'm going to start with the tennis ball, the smaller yellow ball here, and I'm going to select it. Oops. I'm going to select just the tennis ball, and this is the starting position, and I'm going to make sure I'm at frame 1 down here in my time slider, and I've given myself 48 frames. Let's give myself 50 frames just to make it an even number. So I have 50 frames to play with. I may or may not use that many. I'm going to start my cursor, or the starting point, at frame 1, and I'm going to press S to keyframe it. And if it doesn't keyframe, you want to just middle mouse click in the window and keyframe. So now the tennis ball is keyframed in this first position. Now I've done this a couple times. I've done the bouncing ball a few times before, so I have a sense about how many frames it's going to take for it to hit the ground given this distance. And I'm thinking that it's going to, kind of be dropped, or it's some kind of unseen force holding it is going to drop. So I'm going to give it about 10 or 12 frames. Let's just give it 12 frames to start off with. So I'm going to move my cursor to frame 12, and I'm going to move the ball down so it just touches the ground plane, just like that. And I'm also going to move it out because it's going to be a bounce that's moving forward. So I'm going to move it forward a little bit, and I'm going to keyframe it. Now I'm just moving the cursor so I can kind of see sort of the movement here. And let's just make sure that I'm hitting the ground plane. Yes. Now, once it hits the ground, what's it going to do? It's going to bounce up. And I'm not going to do any squash and stretch or anything like that. I'm just doing a basic bounce here. But I'm going to do, it is going to react. It's going to hit the ground and it's going to bounce up. Now, it's going to bounce up slower than it's coming down, of course, because there's gravity working on it. And it's also not going to bounce as high as it started. So I'm going to make it go up. I'm going to bring my cursor to 26, which is 2 frames more than it came down in. And I'm going to move it up like so, not as high as it started, and I'm going to move it forward. and keyframe it. And let's take a look. Boing, boing. Okay. I'm going to move it back a little bit. I don't think that's fine. Now I'm going to move it to the next frame. So now it's going to come down in a little bit less. So let's just have it come down in 10 frames. So I'm going to move it to 36. I'm going to move it down and out a little bit. And there. Boing, boing. There we go. I'm going to give myself a few more frames. I'm going to give myself 80 frames here because I'm running out of room here. Boing, boing. Okay, so now I'm going to also move. It's going to come up a little bit longer, so it's going to come up, let's just say in, let's just say 12 frames. So move it out and up, not as high. Keyframe it. Now I'm noticing something. It seems to be slowing down as I get to this next frame. Now if I want to change this, let's just say I don't like it seems to be taking too long from there to there, and I'm thinking that it needs to be changed. Well, what you can do is I can go to the keyframe, and I want to have it come up a little quicker, which what I would do is I would change the timing between keyframes. So I go to that keyframe, frame 48, and I shift right click, and it's going to highlight that keyframe. It's going to make it red, and then I can left mouse move it anywhere on the timeline. So I'm going to move it back to frame 46. And then if I just click it, it'll undo that selection. And now I'm going to go, so that's going down in 10 frames. And just go to, let's make it 8 frames for it to come down. So it's going to come down and out like so. And keyframe it. Then I'm going to continue it on. So I'm going to go to frame. So that was like 8 frames. Let's just make it 6 frames. Frame 60. So it's going to come up a little bit, out a little bit, and then I'm going to come down in 4 frames. Notice that as I move forward, the spaces between keyframes is getting less and less. Keyframe it. I need to move it forward a little bit. And then I'm going to go to frame 68, another 4 frames, go up and over. Let's go 3 frames, down and over. Let's go 2 frames up, a little over, 2 frames down, over, 1 frame up, a little over, 1 frame down, tiny bit over. Let's just go to frame 80 and just move it over. So now let's just look at this animation now. Okay, so this is looking all right. There's some issues about it, as you can see. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how you can identify some of the awkward motion in your bouncing ball fairly easily. So I'm going to select the ball, and I'm going to go to Window, Animation Editors, graph editor. And what this will do is it'll open up the graph, the motion curves for whatever object that you are working with. So if we look at it, and sometimes the first time that you open up the graph editor, it's not going to have an accurate representation of your curves. It's going to look kind of flat. So if you middle mouse click the graph editor, press A, it's going to scale and focus your curves that you're working with. Now I'm looking at my curves here, and we can isolate it. So I'm going to look at just the translate Y, which is the up and down motion. And what the Y curve, what these curves are, is they give you kind of an accurate representation of what your object is actually doing. And as you can see, it's looking kind of linear and mechanical, and we want to add some smoothness to it. So what we can do now, remember when I went and I opened up my preferences and I went to the animation and I made my default tangents linear. That's what our curves are doing right now. Now we have some linear curves, and if you can see that the curve handles are in a linear motion. Well, that's not working for all of my keyframes here. So I'm going to let's select the top one, and if I select it and I right mouse click over it, I'm going to change that to spline. Now spline will follow to the next curve, but I can also select that curve and I can move it, I can adjust the curve around like that. I can also do another one where I go right mouse over it and I make it a flat curve, and that'll do kind of the same thing that I want to happen. So now let's look and see what happens when I move the ball. Let's just close this down. Notice how now the tennis ball starts a little slow. It's easing out. Boom. And it has a more natural looking reaction to gravity. So let's open up our graph editor again and let's change the rest of these other curves. So let's go to this one. I'm going to change that one to flat. And let's change this one to flat as well. And if you're good and you're good with the mouse, you can actually select all of those at once and make that flat. Let's make this one flat too. And now if we look at the curve, it looks like a accurate representation of what the path of the ball is actually doing. So now let's take a look at the tennis ball and seeing how it's bouncing.